Good evening, friends, fiends, and spooky supernatural beings. Welcome to A Bit Late. It's me, A Bit Frank, and tonight I will be your ghostly guide into the legend of Sleepy Hollow. I myself have lit here a mulled cider candle. Yes, spooky season is all around us, and it never really leaves if we're honest about that. But the whole room smells like apples and spices, and it's just, quite frankly, lovely. And it's perfect for our autumn tale tonight. But without further ado, follow me into Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of river denominated by the ancient Dutch navigators as the Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail and implored the protection of St. Nicholas when they crossed, there lies a small market town or rural port which by some is called Greensburg, but which is more generally and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. This name was given, we are told, in former days by the good housewives of the adjacent county from the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to it, for the sake of being precise and authentic. Well, thank you, Mr. Irving, for including these details. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there's a little valley, or rather lap of land among the high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the world. Oh, that sounds nice. A small brook glides through it with just a murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the occasional whistle of a quail or a tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the uniform tranquility. I recollect that, when a stripling, my first exploit in squirrel shooting was in a grove of tall walnut trees that shades one side of the valley. Oh, so today, actually, I spent 3 hours trying to save a baby squirrel that had fallen out of the tree. I think it was successful, but shooting squirrels sounds kind of opposite my heart at the moment. Anyway, the narrator continues. I had wandered into it at noontime when all nature is peculiarly quiet, and was startled by the roar of my own gun as it broke the Sabbath stillness around and was prolonged and reverberated by the angry echoes. If ever I should wish for a retreat whither I might steal from the world and its distractions and dream quietly away the remnant of a troubled life, I know of none more promising than this little valley. From the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring country. The Sleepy Hollow Boys sounds really tough. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others that an old native chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his ceremonies there before the country was discovered by Master Henrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual reverie. So they're like sleepwalkers? Sleepy walkers all the time? Interesting. Also, this is a lot of flavor. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in any other part of the country, and the nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambols. The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region and seems to be commander-in-chief of all the powers in the air is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. Dun dun dun. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head has been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is ever and anon seen by the country folk hurrying along in the gloom of the night, as if on wings of the wind. Like Howl from the movie? His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of these parts, who have been careful in collecting and collating the floating facts concerning the spectre, allege that the body of the trooper having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head. And that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow, like a midnight blast, is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Another unsuccessful mission. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition, which has furnished materials for many a wild story in that region of shadows. And the spectre is known at all of the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that the visionary propensity I have mentioned is not confined to the native inhabitants of the valley, but is unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time. However wide awake they may have been before they entered that sleepy region, they are sure in a little time to inhale the witching influence of the air and begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams and see apparitions. I mention this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for it is such in little retired Dutch valleys, found here and there embosomed in the great state of New York, that the population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvement which is making such incessant changes in other parts of this restless country sweeps by them unobserved. They're like little time capsules. They are like those little nooks of still water which border a rapid stream, where we may see the straw and bubble riding quietly at anchor, or slowly revolving in their mimic harbor undisturbed by the rush of the passing current. Though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I question whether I should not still find the same trees and the same families vegetating in this sheltered bosom. I like the idea that nothing ages, and I don't think that's what the narrator's saying, but just everything moves slower. In this byplace of nature there abode, in a remote part of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, a worthy wight of the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or as he expressed it, tarried, like Tarrytown, in Sleepy Hollow, for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. I was wondering when we'd get to old Ichabod. We've got a lot of description before we meet him, huh? He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the mind as well as the forest, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodmen and country schoolmasters. The cognomen of Crane was not inapplicable to his person. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dragged a mile out of his sleeves. Wow, he's really tall. Feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at the top, with huge ears, large, glassy green eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. These are very, very visual descriptions, and they do make me kind of chuckle. To see him striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. Hey, Turnip Hen! His schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the windows partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. It was almost ingeniously secured at vacant hours by a withe twisted in the handle of the door and stakes set against the window shutters, so that though a thief might get in with perfect ease, he would find some embarrassment in getting out, an idea most probably borrowed by the architect Jos van Houten from The Mystery of an Eelpot. I may need to do some Google searching, friends and fiends. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by and a formidable birch tree growing out at one end of it. How is a birch tree formidable? Ah well, we'll just have to take his word for it. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices conning over their lessons might be heard in a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the master in the tone of menace or command, or peradventure by the appalling sound of the birch. That's why it's formidable, as he urged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth to say, he was a conscientious man and ever bore in mind the golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's scholars certainly were not spoiled. Oh, I don't like him much, I don't think. He's pretty birch switch happy. I would not have imagined, however, that he was one of those cruel potentiates of school who enjoy in the smarts of their subjects. On the contrary, he administered justice with discrimination rather than severity. Oh, well, I'm glad the narrator thinks that that's what he is, or imagines him to be, rather, taking the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it on those of the strong. Your mere puny stripling that winced at the least flourish of the rod was passed by with indulgence, but the claims of justice were satisfied by inflicting a double portion on some little tough wrong-headed broad-skirted child who sulked and swelled and grew dogged and sullen beneath the birch. He sounds so mean. All this he called doing his duty by their parents. Oh man. And never inflicted a chastisement without following it by the assurance, so consolatory to the smarting child, that, quote, he would remember it and thank him for it the longest day he had to live. When school hours were over, he was even the companion and playmate of the larger boys. What? And on holiday afternoons would convoy some of the smaller ones home, who happened to have pretty sisters, or good housewives for mothers, noted for the comforts of the cupboard. I get the measure of old Ichabod now. Sure. Anyway, indeed it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The revenue arising from his school was small, and it would have been scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread. Okay, understandable. Schools need more funding, for he was a huge feeder, and, though lank, had the dilating powers of an anaconda. What? Sorry. But to help out his maintenance, he was, according to the country custom in those parts, boarded and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he instructed. With these he lived successfully a week at a time, thus going the rounds of the neighborhood, with all his worldly effects tied up in a cotton handkerchief. Okay, this makes a little more sense now. I thought he just liked to eat dinner with pretty ladies who knew how to cook every day, but the school just needs funding. Okay, that all this might not be too onerous on the purposes of his rustic patrons, who are apt to consider the cost of schooling a grievous burden, and schoolmasters as mere drones. Oh, come on now. He had various ways of rendering himself both useful and agreeable. He assisted the farmers occasionally in the lighter labors of their farms, helped them to make hay, mended their fences, took the horses to water, drove the cows from pasture, and cut wood for the winter fire. In addition to teaching, he laid aside, too, all the dominant dignity and absolute sway with which he lorded it in his little empire, the school, and became wonderfully gentle and ingratiating. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers by petting the children. Particularly the youngest, and, like the lion bold, which Wilhelm so magnanimously the lamb did hold, he would sit with one child on his knee and rock a cradle with his foot for hours together. And he's a babysitter? Wow, he does a lot. In addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master of the neighborhood and picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young folks in psalmody. It was a matter of no little vanity to him on Sundays to take his station in front of the church gallery with a band of chosen singers where, in his own mind, he completely carried away the psalm from the parson. Certain it is, his voice resounded far above the rest of the congregation, so he's got some volume, or maybe his superhuman height helps him project more above the heads of others, I don't know. And there are peculiar quavers still to be heard in that church. Oh, cool, he leaves echoes still, and which may even be heard half-mile off, quite to the opposite side of the mill pond on a still Sunday morning, which are said to be legitimately descended from the nose of Ichabod Crane. He certainly left a mark, wow. Definitely like a ghostly echo, right? Thus, by divers little makeshifts in that ingenious way which is commonly denominated by hook and by crook, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought by all who understood nothing of the labor of headwork to have a wonderfully easy life of it. But he still does so much around town. Wow, I guess you can't see brainwaves, so. Anyway, the schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of a rural neighborhood, being considered a kind of idle, gentlemanlike personage of vastly superior taste and accomplishments to the rough country swains, and indeed inferior in learning only to the parson. His appearance, therefore, is apt to occasion some little stir at the tea-table of a farmhouse, and the addition of a supernumerary dish of cakes or sweetmeats, or, peradventure, the parade of a silver teapot. The ladies love to impress Mr. Ichabod Crane, I do believe. That's what we're reading. Our man of letters, therefore, was peculiarly happy in the smiles of all the country damsels. I'm sure he was. How he would figure among them in the courtyard, between services on Sundays, gathering grapes for them from the wild vines that overran the surrounding trees, reciting for their amusement all the epitaphs on the tombstones. That is a very amusing way of wooing someone, I'm sure. I kind of like that. Or sauntering with the whole bevy of them along the banks of the adjacent mill pond. Ichabod's got game. While the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, envying his superior elegance and address. Oh, I sense a rift. From his half-itinerant life also, he was a kind of traveling gazette, carrying the whole budget of local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was, moreover, esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through, and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, he most firmly and potentially believed. Oh boy, oh brother, oh bother. Of course, good grief. He was, in fact, an odd mixture of small shrewdness and simple credulity. His appetite for the marvelous and his powers of digesting it were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in this spellbound region. Ooh, I love the idea of someone with a natural predisposition for the supernatural just gaining strength and absorbing it from this very bewitched grove and glen. No tale was too gross or monstrous for his capacious swallow. It was often his delight, after his school was dismissed in the afternoon, to stretch himself on the rich bed of clover bordering the little brook that whimpered by his schoolhouse, and there con over old Mather's direful tales, until the gathering dusk of the evening made the printed page a mere mist before his eyes. Then, as he wended his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered, every sound of nature at that witching hour fluttered his excited imagination. The moan of the whippoorwill from the hillside, the boding cry of the tree-toad, that harbinger of a storm, the dreary hooting of a screech owl, or the sudden rustling in the thicket of birds frightened from their roost. The fireflies, too, which sparkled most vividly in the darkest places, now and then startled him, as one of uncommon brightness would stream across his path. Interesting, getting spooked by a firefly? Slow-moving lights? But I get it if you're in ghost mode. And if, by chance, a huge blockhead of a beetle came winging his blundering flight against him, the poor Violet was ready to give up the ghost with the idea he was struck by a witch's token. His only resource on such occasion, either to drown thought or drive away evil spirits, was to sing psalm tunes, and the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat by the doors of an evening, were often filled with awe at hearing his nasal melody. In link sweetness long drawn out, floated from the distant hill or along the dusky road. He's like a traveling minstrel, but he only does it 'cause he's so afraid. Or so in tune. Get it, in tune, because he's also singing and in tune with the other side? I'll see myself out, but I'll keep reading. Another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning by the fire, with a row of apples roasting and sputtering along the hearth. Oh, that sounds delicious, and oh, I'm so happy I have that apple candle right now. and listen to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, and haunted fields and haunted brooks and haunted bridges and haunted houses, and particularly of the Headless Horseman, or Galloping Hessian of the Hollow as they sometimes called him. He would delight them equally by his anecdotes of witchcraft and all the direful omens and portentous sights and sounds in the air which prevailed in the earlier times of Connecticut, and would frighten them woefully with speculations upon comets and shooting stars, and with the alarming fact that the world did absolutely turn round and that they were half the time topsy-turvy. Of all the supernatural things, the earth spinning is what gets them. Gotta love it. It's quite cute, actually. But if there was pleasure in all this while snugly cuddling in the chimney corner of a chamber that was all of a ruddy glow from the crackling wood fire, which, wow, that sounds really cozy, and where of course no specter dared to show its face, it was dearly purchased by the terrors of his subsequent walk homewards. What fearful shapes and shadows beset his path amidst the dim and ghastly glare of a snowy night! With what wistful look did he eye every trembling ray of light streaming across the waste fields from some distant window! How often he was appalled by some sheeted shrub covered with snow, which, like a sheeted spectre, beset his very path. I mean, how dare the bush be there, right? And he's got quite an imagination. I kinda love it. How often did he shrink with curdling awe at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dread to look over his shoulder lest he should behold some uncouth being tramping close behind him, and how often he was thrown into complete dismay by some rushing blast howling among the trees and the idea that it was the Galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scourings. Poor Ichabod Crane, his brainwaves work overtime. All these, however, were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in darkness. And though he had seen many specters in his time, and been more than once beset by Satan in divers shapes, in his lonely perambulations, yet daylight put an end to all these devils, and he would have passed a pleasant life of it, in despite of the devil and all his works, if his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal men than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together. And that was a woman. Dun dun dun. Oh no, not a woman. Among the musical disciples who assembled one evening in each week to receive his instructions in psalmody was Katrina van Tassel, the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. Oh dear friends and fiends, get ready for some literary descriptions of women by men. She was a blooming lass of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and melting, and rosy cheeks as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed not merely for her beauty, but for her vast expectations. She was withal a little of a coquette, as might be perceived even in her dress. Oh no, scandal! Which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions as most suited to set off her charms. She wore the ornaments of pure yellow gold, which her great-great-grandmother had brought over from Saardam, the tempting stomacher of the olden time, and withal a provokingly short petticoat. Oh no! To display the prettiest foot and ankle in the country round. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards the sex, and it is not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel, oh no, soon found favor in his eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her paternal mansion. So yes, she's beautiful and she's got money, so he likes her. She's so spooky and scary and so much worse and more terrifying than any of the beings in the forest or Ichabod's head. Oh no. But my friends and fiends, that is where we will end tonight's part of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, on the description of one of the most terrifying, according to the author, beings, Katrina van Tassel. We got into the mind of Ichabod quite a lot. We got a lot of descriptions of Sleepy Hollow, and if Mr. Ichabod Crane's predilections for the supernatural are any indication, I think we have a spooky, spectral time ahead of us. So do stay tuned for the next video. Wahahaha. Now off to sleep and dream what you will, or stay a while and enjoy another tale. Whichever you choose, I'll speak to you again, and until then, stay spooky, my friends. Good night.